Shortly after 10 a.m. on the 20th of July 1944, a 37-year-old colonel in the German army arrived by plane at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. A career cavalry officer, he had served with distinction in Poland, France, Russia, and with Rommel in North Africa. 15 months before, he'd been badly wounded in the desert, losing his left eye, his entire right hand, and 2 fingers of his left. As Chief of Staff to the commander of the Home Army, he had access to top-level military briefing sessions. His name was Claus von Stauffenberg, and his mission on this hot July morning was to kill Hitler. It was his 3rd attempt in 9 days. Accompanying Stauffenberg on July the 20th was his adjutant, Werner von Heften. He had with him a briefcase containing 2 bombs. Shortly before the briefing in the Wolf's Lair was due to take place, the conspirators met in a nearby bunker. There they set about installing and arming the fuses before transferring the bombs to Stauffenberg's briefcase. They only had time to arm the first bomb before they were interrupted by a sergeant who'd been sent to fetch Stauffenberg. He left the unarmed charge with von Heften and hurried off to the conference, briefcase in hand. In the crush of officers around the table, Stauffenberg could not get close to Hitler. A few minutes later, he left the room on the pretext of attending to an urgent matter, leaving the suitcase against a table leg. Just after 12:40 p.m., the bomb it contained exploded. In the confusion that followed, Stauffenberg and von Heften made their escape and returned to the airfield, tossing the second unused bomb from the open vehicle. Shortly after 1 p.m., they took off for Berlin to meet with other conspirators in army headquarters who were ready to launch Operation Valkyrie, the coup that was scheduled to take place as soon as Hitler had been assassinated. But Hitler had survived. The coup failed, and by the evening of the same day, Stauffenberg and other members of the conspiracy had been rounded up and shot at army headquarters in Berlin. Further executions followed. The assassination attempt of July the 20th was just one of over a dozen plots to take Hitler's life after he came to power in 1933. As always, his uncanny good fortune had saved him. While 4 people around him in the briefing room were killed and others seriously wounded, Hitler suffered only minor injuries. It seemed as if the man was invincible. But would the assassination attempt have achieved anything even if it had succeeded? By the 20th of July 1944, the tide of the war had turned decisively against Germany. Allied troops were pouring into France from the Normandy beachheads, and their leaders were in no mood to accept anything but Germany's unconditional surrender, with or without Hitler. In a letter he wrote to fellow conspirator Henning von Tresckow, Stauffenberg pondered whether it was already too late.
Stauffenberg hat gefragt, nach der Landung der Alliierten, also der USA in der Normandie, ob es dann überhaupt noch einen Sinn haben könnte, jetzt ein Attentat zu machen. Und Tresckow hat geantwortet, ob es noch einen Erfolg haben kann. Das steht jetzt nicht mehr zur Debatte. Wichtig ist die Tat als solches. Diesen Attentätern war bewusst, dass ein Aufstand des Gewissens, dass ein Akt des Aufstandes gegen Hitler erforderlich sei, um in Deutschland den Gedanken an Menschenwürde wieder zu errichten.
On a broad view, resistance within Germany was the resistance that failed. It failed to remove Hitler or restrain him from embarking on military adventures that would end in ruin. It failed to bring down the Nazi regime or prevent the atrocities committed by the SS and the Gestapo in occupied countries. It failed to prevent the slaughter of Jews and others deemed by the Nazis to be racially or socially degenerate. Divided by class and politics, it failed to unify around concrete aims and settle on a realistic plan of action. Crucially, it failed to establish credibility with the countries ranged against Germany and was never able to call on outside help.
Der Widerstand war zweifellos sinnlos, wenn man darunter den Erfolg fassen will. Er war nicht sinnlos, sondern er ist ein Zeichen dafür, dass nicht die ganze Bevölkerung in Deutschland wie ein Mann oder wie eine Frau bis zum Ende hinter Hitler und den Nationalsozialisten stand, sondern dass es Menschen gab, die auf verschiedene Weise sich verweigerten.
Even those opposed to Hitler had to admit that he was hugely popular. Many people saw him as the savior of Germany, avenging the crushing defeat in World War I and the humiliating terms she had been forced to accept in the Treaty of Versailles. Under the terms of the treaty, she had surrendered her overseas colonies, ceded territory to France, Belgium, Poland and Czechoslovakia, had her army reduced to a token force of 100,000 men, and had been forced to pay war reparations of over £6.5 billion sterling. Hitler's passionate and unflagging denunciation of the treaty played a large part in attracting support for his party. As the Weimar Republic staggered from one crisis to another, many Germans believed the country was crying out for a strong and visionary leader. And some were ready to believe that it had found him. In 1923, unable to bear the crippling burden of war reparations, the German economy collapsed and her currency became valueless. America bailed her out, but when Wall Street crashed, the subsequent worldwide depression caused misery and massive unemployment in Germany. By 1932, over 30% of the workforce was out of work. In the election campaign of that year, Hitler promised to abolish unemployment.
Hitler's rise to power was not only assisted by these factors, but also, and most strongly, by the non-identification of the people with the Republic. So everything he did was against the Weimar Republic, and that found a wide echo among the people who disliked the Republic for various reasons. So Hitler swam on that crest of the hatred of the Republic.
Winning 230 seats in July 1932, the Nazis were now the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. But ordinary people as well as politicians were still deeply suspicious of the Nazis, not least because of the reputation of Hitler's private army, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, identified by their army surplus brown shirts and their swastika armbands. The SA's job was to protect Hitler at mass rallies and to beat and terrorize Jews and political opponents. Led by Ernst Röhm, they numbered 170,000, nearly twice the size of the German army. In the November election, the Nazis lost seats, but the Conservatives saved them.
Die konservativen Parteien sind ja mit den Nationalsozialisten ein Bündnis eingegangen. Bis 1934 war es ja nicht eine Alleinherrschaft der Nationalsozialisten, sondern im Bunde mit den konservativen Parteien. Die große Erwartung der konservativen Eliten war es, man würde Hitler zähmen in dieser Regierung, man würde ihn einbinden können. Das war die große Fehlkalkulation dieser konservativen Kräfte, dass Hitler sie alle an die Wand gespielt hat.
To increase his support, Hitler began to whip up fears of a Bolshevik takeover and called another election for March 1933. Heinz Frauendorf, who was 12 at the time, remembers campaigning for the Communists, the KPD.
Gebracht worden. Und so auch von meinem Klassenkameraden, der Schwager. Der war nun bei der Rotfront, Brigade oder was, der uns auch hin und wieder mal, wenn Wahlen oder so war oder Veranstaltungen, 50 Pfennig gab. Das passte allerdings auf und dann mussten 4, 5 oder 6 Kinder in unserem Alter, 12, 13, 14, in den Hündernhöfen dann vor allen Dingen bei der Wahl 33 intonieren. Also einer sprach vor, was haben wir, soll ich sagen? Was haben wir? Hunger. Was wollen wir? Brot, schrien die anderen dann. Und wir lachten uns natürlich kaputt als Kinder. Nicht? Wir wussten ja gar nicht, was das bedeuten sollte. Aber dann wählt KPD. Nicht? Und dann nach 10 Hinterhöfen hatten wir unsere 50 Pfennig verdient.
On February the 27th, the Reichstag building went up in flames. Hitler used the incident as a pretext to arrest communist candidates and issue an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. Some left-wing candidates were murdered by the SA, and large numbers of communists and social democrats, the SPD, were sent to newly opened concentration camps. But when the election came, the Nazis still could not win an overall majority, polling only 44%.
So people should never think that Hitler had the majority of the German voters behind him. He never got the 50% or 51%, which was necessary to change the constitution. But he then got rid of the constitution very rapidly, with the aid of the Catholic Centre Party, which thought that communism was worse than National Socialism. All the German institutions were got rid of. And Hitler did this without having a majority, but relying on the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act was only passed with the support of the Catholic Centre Party, but with the opposition of the SPD.
The Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorial powers. He set about using them ruthlessly. At the start of May, trades unions were disbanded to be replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. By July, all political parties were dissolved. Political opponents, so-called enemies of the state, were tortured and beaten in Heldenkellen, hero cellars, of which there were 50 in Berlin alone. Countless opponents of the regime simply disappeared during the first weeks and months of Nazi rule.
Es hatte sich an sich gleich nach der Wahl nicht viel geändert. Nur eigenartigerweise waren viele junge Männer, die so um die 25, 30, mit einmal verschwunden. Nur keiner kam auf die Idee zu sagen, wo die sind.
Several political leaders on the left escaped by fleeing abroad, abandoning to their fate the workers who supported them. One who did not was Julius Leber, leader of the Social Democratic Party in the North German city of Lübeck and a deputy in the Reichstag. He barely escaped being murdered by the Nazis the day after Hitler seized power and spent the next 4 years in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. On his release, he became one of the most committed, clear-sighted and charismatic members of the German resistance. He was later drawn into the July 20th plot by Stauffenberg. The Nazi policy of Gleichschaltung, or conformity to the party line and codes of behaviour, inevitably brought it into conflict with the churches. In 1933, 3,000 of Germany's 17,000 Protestant pastors supported the Nazis through the right-wing and anti-Semitic Christian movement. But inevitably, disputes and schisms arose. A minority continued to protest against the barbarities of the regime. A central figure was Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was arrested in 1937 and sentenced to 7 months' jail after a show trial. On his release, Hitler had him rearrested and thrown into Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he remained until the end of the war. In the Catholic Church, individual clerics such as Bishop Galen of Munster did speak out, but their efforts were undermined by internal disputes. By the autumn of 1933, brown shirt numbers had increased over 3 million. They looked on bitterly as conservative politicians, aristocrats, capitalists and generals flocked to Hitler's banner. These were the very men whose world they wanted to smash. They continued to hold gigantic military parades, sow terror in the streets and set up wildcat concentration camps. Slogans began to circulate demanding a second revolution. The brown shirt leader, Ernst Röhm, stated that the defense of the realm was now entirely a matter for the SA, and that the army was little more than a military training school. Werner von Blomberg, Minister of War, conspired with Göring and Himmler, who also feared Röhm's growing power, to blacken his name and force Hitler to remove him. In May 1934, Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, launched the campaign of intrigue and rumors against Röhm. Secret reports were leaked advising that the brown shirts were planning a revolt. Army weapons were discreetly made available to Hitler's private bodyguard, the 50,000-strong Schutzstaffel, or SS. In the early hours of June the 30th, SS death squads began to fan out through Berlin. Hitler himself arrested Röhm in his bed. It came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives. Officially, 61 SA traitors were executed, while 13 were shot while resisting arrest. The actual figure was probably between 200 and 400.
It was really a decapitating of the SA movement, which took place in the summer of '34 on the Night of the Long Knives. But Hitler got also rid of some other people who had been political opponents or people who had been not that far away from him, like General Schleicher, who had been Chancellor in 1932 for a short while, and could focus or become the focus for an opposition, and therefore he was got rid of and murdered.
Schleicher was not the only general killed, but the army, tainted by the part it had played in the massacre, failed to call Hitler to account for their murder. Blomberg even forbade officers to attend Schleicher's funeral, and a month later, when President Hindenburg died and Hitler became head of state, Blomberg ordered all officers and enlisted men to swear a personal oath of allegiance to the Führer Adolf Hitler, offering him unconditional obedience. It was an event that would complicate resistance to Hitler within the army for years to come.
Die Konsequenz war, dass sich viele Offiziere sehr zurückhielten mit dem Anschluss an Widerstandsgruppen, sich sehr zurückhielten mit Protesten gegen Maßnahmen der Nationalsozialisten, weil sie ja einen Eid auf den Führer abgelegt hatten. Dennoch muss man sagen, dass dieser Eid, der ja auch in Deutschland eine Tradition hatte, denn im Kaiserreich waren die Offiziere und die Soldaten auf den Kaiser, also auch auf eine Person vereidigt worden, nicht so sehr diejenigen, die erkannt hatten, wie verbrecherisch das Regime war, abschreckte. Es schreckte aber die Menschen ab oder es diente zur Rechtfertigung der Menschen, die sich an Widerstandsaktionen nicht beteiligen wollten. Sie konnten sagen, wir dürfen nicht, wir haben ja einen Eid auf den Führer abgelegt.
The relationship between Hitler and the army was always complex. Distrust and animosity were balanced by a common hatred of the political left and a shared desire to avenge the humiliations of the past. Each sought to exploit the other, and, at least initially, they had aims in common. When, in 1936, Hitler gave the order to reoccupy the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, the army and many ordinary citizens began to feel a swelling sense of self-respect. But when, on November 5, 1937, Hitler announced his intention to take military action against Czechoslovakia and Austria in the near future, Blomberg and the Commander-in-Chief of the army, Werner von Fritsch, argued strongly that such overt aggression would force the Western powers to retaliate, resulting in global conflict. Never one to brook dissent, Hitler used the fact that Blomberg had married a prostitute to force his resignation. Fritsch was also forced to step down on a trumped-up charge of homosexuality. Hitler assumed direct and personal control of the armed forces, and on March 13, 1938, at the invitation of the ruling Austrian Nazi Party, he ordered German troops into Austria, proclaiming Anschluss, or union with Germany. It was a bloodless coup. Hitler's triumphant entry into Vienna was met by jubilation, flowers and the pealing of bells. His approval rating at home soared. As it became apparent that Hitler was setting Germany on a course that would lead to war, resistance began to harden and figures began to emerge. Prominent amongst them was Hans Oster, who was Chief of Military Intelligence of the OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces. On the civilian side, the pivotal figure was Karl Goerdler, who, as mayor of Leipzig, had worked indefatigably to counter Nazi criminality. Another group formed in the Foreign Office around Adam von Trotzu-Solz, including the diplomat Erich Kort. After the Fritsch affair, they were joined by senior army officers. Many of them became part of a sustained pilgrimage to London in the summer of 1938. One emissary after another attempted to persuade the British government to issue a strongly worded declaration of Western determination to oppose any such aggression. The pitiful failure of these forays to London was in large measure due to Chamberlain's appeasement policy and his inability to understand Hitler. But beyond that was the fact that nearly all of these self-declared opponents of the regime held posts within it. They were tainted even before they opened their mouths. It was a pattern of events that was to be repeated. In spite of persistent efforts by the resistance to make common cause with London against Hitler, efforts that were to last throughout the whole war, the British authorities never changed their attitude. Despite early setbacks, resistance was growing. The circles that had formed in the Foreign Office and in military intelligence were joined by radically minded men like the lawyer Peter Jörg von Wartenberg and Deputy Prefect of the Berlin Police, Fritz Dietloff von der Schulenburg. Oster brought in the commander of the Berlin military district, Erwin von Witzleben. The first serious attempt to put pressure on Hitler in the summer of 1938 came from Ludwig Beck, the Army Chief of General Staff, who'd always argued strongly against Hitler's war plans. He attempted to persuade Walter von Brauchitsch, who had replaced Fritsch as Commander-in-Chief of the army, to get his generals to resign en masse. Brauchitsch refused, and Beck himself resigned, the only general to do so in peacetime. His successor, Franz Halder, made common cause with Oster and the other conspirators, and detailed plans for a coup began to take shape. By mid-September, the plans were ready. A special task force had been assembled that, under Witzleben's command, would force its way into the Reich Chancellery, overpower the SS guards, and arrest Hitler. All that remained was for Halder to give the signal to act as soon as Hitler issued orders to invade Czechoslovakia. None of the conspirators could have foreseen that Chamberlain was about to throw a spanner in the works. In late September 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain confounded everyone by flying to Germany twice in 1 week to meet Hitler in an attempt to resolve the crisis that had arisen over the Führer's demand that Germany should take over the Sudetenland. On the 29th of September, the Munich Agreement was signed. ceding the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a promise that he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. Joy and relief amongst the general public was matched by the utter despair of the conspirators.
The end of the Munich crisis in September 1938 brought this coup very quickly to an end because Hitler did not resort to war in that instance. And the whole morale of the plotters and the attempts and organizational efforts made to bring this coup about fell to pieces.
Months would pass before the resistance would recover from the blow it had suffered at Munich. Hitler, meanwhile, forged relentlessly ahead. On the night of November the 9th, so-called spontaneous demonstrations of SA mobs occurred all over Germany. 400 synagogues were burnt down. 7,500 Jewish-owned shops were demolished, and 91 Jews were killed. It became known as Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, because of all the broken glass.
Eine große Anzahl von Geschäften war zertrümmert. Die Splitter lagen auf der Straße und ich bin da durch diese Splitter gewartet. Und dann habe ich meinen Vater zu Hause gefragt, was denn da los gewesen sei in einer solchen Stadt wie Hannover. Dann sagte er mir, er hätte gerade in der Zeitung gelesen, das deutsche Volk sei spontan aufgestanden und hätte sich gegen die Juden, hätte eine Art von Widerstand gegen die Juden geleistet, weil nämlich ein junger Jude, der Herschel Grünspan, einen Botschaftsangehörigen in Paris erschossen hätte. Seine Eltern seien im KZ.
In the wake of Kristallnacht, an estimated 20,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps. People were horrified and shamed, but by and large they remained silent. In March 1939, Hitler fulfilled his dreams of taking Prague, sending motorized units into the city and overrunning the western provinces of Czechoslovakia. Then, to no one's surprise, he turned his attention to Poland. The outbreak of hostilities on September the 1st, followed 2 days later by France and Britain's declaration of war, confirmed all the worst predictions and warnings of the regime's opponents. Opposition began to harden again.
The brutal methods the German army used in destroying the Polish army and then occupying Poland upset a number of officers, and there are a number of them who wrote to their field marshals and to the chief of staff and to Hitler that they objected to the methods the SS used in their occupation policy, which was already heavily influenced by Nazi ideology, and the brutality was abhorrent to them.
Commander-in-Chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch, shared his general's horror at the appalling barbarity of the Einsatzkommandos, Himmler's SS death squads in Poland. But while he steadfastly stonewalled all requests to take action, Franz Halder and the conspirators in military intelligence, the Foreign Office and the High Command decided on the last day of October that action could no longer be delayed. Erich Kort, who had access to the Chancellery, volunteered to throw the bomb that would kill Hitler. Oster promised to have the materials ready by November the 11th. Intense preparations were made for the coup that would follow the assassination. The date he had set for the offensive was November the 12th. On November the 8th, something completely unexpected happened. Georg Elser, a Swiss clockmaker working in Germany, had come to hate the Nazis for their stranglehold on the unions. Acting alone, at the dead of night, he labored for weeks in Munich's Bürgerbraukeller Hall to install a time bomb in a column beside the main podium where Hitler was due to speak. At 6 a.m. on Monday the 6th of November, Elser set off the timer. The 50-kilogram bomb was timed to explode 2 days later at 9:20 p.m. when Hitler would be in full flow. It worked flawlessly. 8 people closest to the podium were killed. 75 others lay injured. But, totally unexpectedly, Hitler had cut short his speech and left the Bürgerbraukeller just 8 minutes before the bomb exploded. The event had a catastrophic effect on the conspiracy back in Berlin. Heightened security measures increased the difficulties that they were having in procuring the material for Kurt's bomb. At the last minute, Oster got cold feet and cancelled the operation. Once again, Hitler's extraordinary good luck had saved him. And his good fortune continued. In June 1940, after the French campaign, a group of officers planned to shoot Hitler during a parade of troops down the Champs-Élysées. But the parade was cancelled for fear of British air attacks. One-time Berlin police chief Franz Dietloff von der Schulenburg attempted to form a commando unit to undertake Hitler's assassination. Once again, Hitler's unpredictable changes of location scotched the plan. Through 1940 and 1941, circles of civilian resistance gathered strength. Conservatives like retired General Ludwig Beck gravitated towards the indefatigable former mayor of Leipzig, Karl Goerdeler. Goerdeler's appeal also allowed him to draw in some socialist and former trade union leaders. At the same time, a predominantly Christian group known as the Kreisau Circle formed around Helmut James von Moltke. The group included the socialist Carlo Mierendorf, who joined after his release from a 5-year stint in Lichtenberg concentration camp. As they had no means of putting their ideas into practice, critics described them as nothing more than a talking shop.
Es gab unterschiedliche Konzeptionen, in welcher Form ein autoritäres Regierungssystem errichtet werden sollte, ob womöglich eine Rückkehr, eine Wiedererrichtung der Monarchie in Frage käme. Da gab es besondere Schwierigkeiten im Deutschen Reich, weil in der Hohenzollernmonarchie sich niemand fand, der bereit gewesen wäre, diese Rolle zu übernehmen. Andere wollten ja eine in agrarromantischer Vorstellung eine Auflösung der Massengesellschaft erreichen.
While the conservative and Christian groups looked to the army to stage the coup that would allow them to bring their idealistic notions into reality, opponents on the left could only hold fast to their beliefs and try to survive unnoticed by the Gestapo.
We must always not forget that there are the communists and the Social Democrats who work in the underground all the way through till spring 1944, when a major communist underground group is lifted by the Gestapo and destroyed. They have been working for a change all the way, and it would be wrong to concentrate on the National Conservatives only.
Arvid Harnack and his wife were among the many communists arrested and executed by the regime. Communist groups were always heavily targeted by the Gestapo, but they were not alone.
Es gab das ausgebildete Spitzelwesen der Gestapo, aber einen noch viel größeren Einfluss hatte das Denunziantenwesen. Und für mich ist es eines der ganz traurigen Kapitel in der Geschichte des Dritten Reiches, wie verbreitet das Denunziantenwesen gewesen ist. Die Motive für Denunziation lagen dabei in den selteneren Fällen auf dem politischen Gebiet, sondern es waren Rachegefühle gegen Nachbarn, es waren Eifersuchtsdramen zwischen Eheleuten, es war Karrierestreben, um sich auszuzeichnen für eine bestimmte Position, die dazu führten, dass Menschen ihre Nachbarn, ihre Freunde oder ihre früheren Freunde, ihre Ehepartner denunzierten. Mit dem unklaren Wissen oder auch dem klaren Wissen, was für Gefahren diesen Denunzierten drohte.
A small group of Munich students who went under the name White Rose were horrified by the brutality of the regime, particularly against Jews. They issued appeals and painted slogans on walls calling for an uprising against Hitler. On February the 18th, Hans and Sophie Scholl were arrested for distributing leaflets. The Nazis were stunned by their effrontery. In a trial lasting less than 3.5 hours, they were sentenced to death and executed on the same day.
They were not very effective, obviously, but they were very important because the news spread through Germany at the time among students that there was a movement in Munich which had objected to the Hitler regime. And I think, though perhaps it's difficult to know whether the majority of students were still on Hitler's side or not, but at least it made them begin to think that not everything was right just to follow Hitler, so their sacrifice might not have been in vain.
Hitler's Russian campaign hardened resistance within the army in the field. It was not just the series of military defeats, culminating in the capitulation of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943, that motivated their hatred of Hitler. What disgusted them were the brutal atrocities committed by the Einsatzgruppen against the Russians, and the infamous Commissar Order, requiring that any Red Army political commissars captured should be immediately shot. For officers like Henning von Tresckow, Helmut Stief, and Fabian von Schlabrendorf, the orgy of executions were an indelible stain on the army's honor.
I think with Tresckow is one of the most interesting characters. He belongs to the new generation of the resistors, not the old generals or field marshals or former politically established figures, but the new lot who were much more active. Among the older lot, there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism. They didn't object to every policy with the final solution, etc. They thought of resettlement and all sorts of things, whereas Tresckow objected with Stauffenberg to the final solution, to the murder of the Jews. He represented this new element and wanted radical actions.
It was not until March the 13th, 1943, that Hitler agreed to visit the army group at Smolensk, where Tresckow was based. At least 3 different assassination attempts were planned for that day. One of them called for a bomb to be placed in Hitler's vehicle. A second involved an ambush, but the presence of Hitler's SS guards prevented both. In the end, Tresckow opted to ask one of Hitler's party to carry a package containing a couple of bottles of Cointreau back to Rastenburg with him on Hitler's plane. As he explained it, it was a debt he owed to Colonel Stief. The package was, of course, a bomb. At the airfield, Schlabrendorf discreetly squeezed the package to break the acid detonator and handed it over. Hitler and his party boarded the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor and took off. 30 minutes later, they should have been blown out of the sky. Once again, Hitler's luck held. The bomb failed to detonate. Later, the conspirators managed to retrieve it. Schlabrendorf opened the package with a razor blade and removed the detonator. The acid had done its work. The firing pin had struck the percussion cap and ignited it, but the explosive had not gone off. It remains a mystery to this day, but possibly the plastic explosive had become too cold in the plane's cargo hold. Shattered by his failure, Tresckow nevertheless refused to become despondent, and only a week later another assassination attempt was made by an officer who had agreed to act as a suicide bomber. The occasion was a visit by Hitler to the Berlin Zughaus to view an exhibition of captured enemy weaponry that Tresckow's army group had put together. The shortest fuse available was a 10-minute one, and once he had ignited it, the suicide bomber stuck closely to Hitler, attempting to interest him in the objects on display. But Hitler paid no attention. Nervously, as if scenting danger, he scurried through the exhibition and abruptly left by a side door into the chestnut grove on Unter den Linden. His would-be assassin rushed for the nearest toilet and ripped the fuse out of the bomb.
It was just a combination of ill luck, Hitler's knack, as if he anticipated that people would carry out an attempt on his life against him, and just fortune or misfortune, as you might say.
From here on, the task of assassinating Hitler would pass to Claus von Stauffenberg. But time was running out. At the Casablanca conference, Churchill and Roosevelt had made it clear that nothing short of Germany's unconditional surrender would satisfy the Allies. So an assassination, even if successful, held out no hope of shortening the war. Meanwhile, the Nazi intelligence operation was closing in on the conspirators. Together with Tresckow, General Friedrich Olbricht, and Merz von Quernheim, Olbricht's new chief of staff, Stauffenberg set about revising plans for a coup. They hit upon the notion of tailoring an official strategy approved by Hitler for their own ends. The official plan, which was called Operation Valkyrie, was to use the reserve army to put down an uprising by foreign workers if it ever occurred. The crucial difference was that the conspirators planned to add an announcement that Hitler had been assassinated by rogue Nazis. Martial law would be declared. Nazi leaders like Himmler, Göring and Goebbels would be arrested, the SS would be disarmed, and key installations would be occupied. It was a gigantic hoax. Its weakness that, apart from Hitler himself, the only person who could launch Operation Valkyrie was the leader of the reserve army, Erich Fromm. He would either have to be neutralized or brought into the conspiracy. Fromm refused to join, but hinted that he might support the conspirators if they succeeded in assassinating Hitler. It was hardly a secure foundation for mounting a coup. Stauffenberg originally intended to remain in Berlin to direct the coup, while someone who'd not suffered his crippling injuries actually carried out the assassination. But none of the attempts planned for the latter half of 1943 and the start of 1944 came to anything. Soon after the Normandy landings, Stauffenberg decided that, as he had access to Hitler's military briefings, he would have to carry the bomb himself. It was a fatal error. In the course of 9 days, he had 3 opportunities to assassinate Hitler. On July the 11th, he flew to Berchtesgaden with a bomb, but on discovering that Göring and Himmler would not be present at the meeting, he aborted the plan. On July the 15th, he attended another briefing, this time at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. A photograph taken on that day shows Stauffenberg in the group around Hitler before the meeting took place. The assassination attempt failed when the briefing ended early, before Stauffenberg could get the bomb into place. The third and final attempt would be made 5 days later. Blocking all official signal traffic from Hitler's headquarters after the assassination planned for July 20th was a key part of the plan. It would give the conspirators in Berlin time to launch Operation Valkyrie, wrest power from the Nazi leadership, gain control of the radio stations, and neutralize the SS and troops loyal to Hitler. The man deputed to do this was Erich Feldgiebel, chief of the Army Signal Corps based at Hitler's headquarters. This he achieved, but the telephone call he himself made to Berlin was to inform the conspirators that Hitler had survived the attack. While Stauffenberg flew back to Berlin, the conspirators hesitated. By the time he arrived, Himmler had rescinded the order blocking signal traffic, and the news of Hitler's survival was out. In Berlin, Paris, Vienna and Prague, the coup collapsed. Soldiers loyal to the regime forced their way into army headquarters and released Fromm. There was a shootout in which Stauffenberg was wounded. Fromm arrested him, along with Albrecht and Heften. Beck tried to shoot himself but failed. One of Fromm's men finished off the job. The conspirators were marched out into the courtyard, where, under the headlights of lined-up military vehicles, they were shot by firing squad. That night, Hitler addressed the German people on radio, attributing his survival to the work of Providence and promising to settle accounts with the conspirators the way we National Socialists are accustomed to settling them. Soldiers as far away as Russia heard the news.
Wir hatten ja ein Funkgerät, also ein Gustav-Gerät nannte sich das, trägt der Funk auf dem Rücken. Und da konnte er das so laut drehen, dass sie das bis Moskau hören konnten. Und da aufgedreht, Adolf spricht. Ja, ein gemeines und feiges Offiziersklicke hat versucht, mich zu ermorden oder so ähnlich. Na, das war's dann, ne? Fast alle haben sich die Hände gerieben, ne? Aber war nichts. Ne? Dazu waren sie zu feige, sich selber mit in die Luft zu sprengen. Ne? Die haben das schon ein paar Mal versucht. Und als Offiziere, als aktive Profis, kriegen sie nicht mal fertig, so einen umzubringen.
In retrospect, that judgment is harsh. The conspirators paid a terrible price for their failure. In the days and weeks that followed, Gestapo torturers dragged out of their prisoners the names of others who had been involved. Some, like Treschow, committed suicide. Others, including Lieber, Witzleben, Oster, Stief, Fellgiebel, Schulenburg, Gödler and Trotzu-Solz, were tried in the People's Court and executed. Many more Germans were to die in prison or in concentration camps before the war was over. Most of these enemies of the Nazis had neither the means nor the opportunity to do anything to bring down the regime. In the end, the very hopelessness of their position is what actually gave the German resistance its dignity and heroism. On the night of February the 28th, 1943, a 9-man team of British-trained Norwegian resistance fighters carried out a daring act of sabotage that echoed around the world. Their target was the heavy water plant situated at Vemork in the Telemark region, 150 miles from Oslo. Towering above the plant was the infamous Hardangervidda, a frozen plateau renowned for its inhospitable terrain and ferocious winter weather. Standing on a cliff, accessible only by a bridge across a deep gorge, Vemork was thought by the Germans to be impregnable. The raid that night was to prove them disastrously wrong, and dealt a fatal blow to Hitler's long-term war aims. In 1943, Germany and America were locked in a deadly race to be the first to create the atomic bomb. Whoever won the race would possess a weapon that could end the war at a stroke. Heavy water, D2O, which is rich in the rare isotope of hydrogen known as deuterium, was considered indispensable to moderate nuclear reactions. In 1943, Vemork was the only plant in the world where heavy water was produced continuously. Ironically, when they set out from their SOE base in Britain, none of the 9 men involved in the raid had any notion of its vital significance.
None of us had ever heard about the atomic bomb. But when my group left, Colonel Wilson said to me that this job is very, very important. If the Germans get hold of heavy water, they will be able to blow up some part of London or world like that. Well, I didn't believe him. He's telling me this because he wants us to do a good job. But the first I knew about the atomic bomb was when the bomb fell on Hiroshima.
The Wehrmacht sabotage operation was a complete success. Surveying the damage, Generaloberst Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, head of the Wehrmacht forces in Norway, described the raid as the most splendid coup I have seen in this war. It was a coup that could only have been carried out by men with intimate local knowledge, an inbred capacity to cope with the harsh terrain, and sharply honed survival skills. In other words, by native Norwegians. The path to effective, organized resistance had been a long and painful one for Norway. It began when the German army launched Operation Weserübung on the 9th of April 1940, sweeping into Norway and Denmark in a meticulously planned lightning assault that succeeded in placing German troops on the streets of Oslo and Copenhagen within the first 24 hours. Citizens in both capitals were stunned by the speed of the occupation and appalled by the violation of their neutrality. The swastika was run up the flagpole of the Akershus fort, the headquarters of the Norwegian military, even as German troops were seizing control of airfields and the country's main coastal towns: Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, Kristiansand and Narvik. But the shock of events did not prevent the Norwegians from achieving one vital victory on the day of invasion, when they sank the German heavy cruiser Blücher in Oslo Fjord with coastal gunfire. This allowed King Haakon VII to make good his escape from the capital, along with the government and other members of the Storting, the Norwegian parliament. When the Germans demanded Norway's capitulation, Haakon refused point blank. In Oslo, Vidkun Quisling, leader of the Norwegian Nazi Party, announced that he had temporarily taken over the reins of power and declared resistance to German troops a crime. It was a time of choice for the Norwegian people. Gunnar Sernsteby, a resistance fighter and Norway's most decorated military hero, sums up the feelings of the population at that time.
To begin with, it was all a shock to everybody. So in the first period, it was very difficult what to do, but we understood that we had now got the Nazi tyranny, which was well known in Germany. Well, hadn't realized what they have been through, I think. But we had it now and felt it for 5 years.
The weeks that followed the German invasion were confused and chaotic. British, French and Polish troops fought alongside the Norwegians in a doomed attempt to win back Trondheim and to throw the Germans out of Narvik in the north. It was from here that iron ore, freighted by rail from the Swedish mines at Gällivare, was exported to Germany. In the final week of May, Allied forces succeeded in recapturing the port. But with France crumbling under the onslaught of von Rundstedt's panzers, the British troops in Norway could no longer be supported. They were desperately needed elsewhere. On the 31st of May, the order was given to evacuate Narvik. By June the 7th, most of the Allied troops had embarked, leaving Norway to its fate at the hands of the Germans. On the same day, King Haakon and his cabinet boarded HMS Devonshire at Tromsø and sailed for England. It would be 5 years before he returned to Norwegian soil. 3 days later, Norway capitulated. The doomed Allied campaign in Norway during the early summer of 1940 had an important political effect in Britain. It was the final nail in the coffin of Neville Chamberlain's government. On the 10th of May, he resigned and was replaced by Winston Churchill. As acting First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill's own part in the abortive Norwegian campaign had not been blameless. But the country wanted as its leader someone who, by his implacable opposition to the policy of appeasement, gave notice of a new determination to stand up to Hitler. For the time being, however, there was very little anybody could do to help the Norwegians, who were coming to terms with living under the Nazi yoke.
It was a general feeling that maybe the war was lost, and remaining politicians in Norway, they got into some sort of negotiations with the Germans. What the Germans wanted was to create a new regime, and they persuaded in various ways Norwegian politicians to let go of the government, renouncing the government, and even urging the king to abdicate. His answer, which was in fact written by the foreign minister, was given in a speech from London, which cleared everything. It was a resounding no to abdication, and making it very clear that the government in exile was Norway's government. And that was a really morale booster for most Norwegians.
But for a country that hadn't been engaged in war for 125 years, learning how to resist an occupying power was hard. At first, there was no question of any kind of armed resistance. There were no underground networks, no arms, no support from abroad, no men trained in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Inevitably, the first signs of resistance came from among ordinary civilians.
The paperclip is thought to be a Norwegian invention. During the occupation, people started wearing paperclips in their jackets, almost like that, as a demonstration, as a symbol. We cling together, we keep together. So it was a sign of national unity against the German and the Norwegian Nazis. So this was one of many such signs which can be categorized as the paperclip spirit, maybe.
This found expression in an almost universal hatred of Quisling and the Norwegian Nazi party, the National Samling. In the autumn of 1940, Reichskommissar Josef Terboven abolished all other political parties and formally installed Quisling as Prime Minister.
Quisling does struggle to gain popular support. He was the head of a minority party, probably didn't get more than 2 or 3% of the vote prior to the war, and although he hoped to get a membership of about 100,000 during the war, he only gets a membership of 35,000. Whereas the king remains, how shall we say, the heart of Norwegian society, providing a focus, a centre of unity, I think, for the Norwegian population. He's broadcasting, of course, from Britain, and you have a fairly homogenous society actively opposed, at least mentally, to the German occupation.
For most civilians, resistance was passive. It took the form of a dogged refusal to cooperate. One of the first groups to make their feelings known were the country's sportsmen, who went on strike, refusing to take any part in Nazi-run competitions. In December 1940, the Supreme Court protested against Nazi encroachments on the rule of law, and leading judges resigned en masse. In 1941, 22 civil service organizations issued a letter of protest to Terboven. Many professionals from all walks of life, including engineers, lawyers, accountants and dentists, joined what they saw as an ideological struggle for the soul of their country by utterly refusing to cooperate.
The Nazi party tried to get hold of the organizations, so it was really, to a large extent, a battle for organizational Norway. And so lots of these organizations were voluntarily disbanding themselves and went underground. So you had networks of doctors and lawyers and such kinds, and even teachers and even officers. So that was the first thing I think. Organizational networks.
Early in 1941, the country's Lutheran Church issued a powerful statement condemning the new administration and rallying the populace. Eventually, the struggle came to a head over the issue of a new catechism demanding obedience to the party. The bishops resigned en masse, followed by 797 of the country's 858 incumbent clergy. Many leading churchmen of various denominations were arrested and interned or banished from their parishes.
The Norwegian church is empty, and they protest, believe it or not, to the Reichskommissar, Joseph Terboven, essentially the German ruler of Norway, above Quisling's head. And Terboven, always keen to embarrass Quisling, didn't like him very much, I didn't really rate him or his party, actually tells Quisling to drop this. Essentially, when it came down to it, the Norwegians could get away with civil resistance on issues like this, so long as it didn't undermine overall German control or undermine production for the German economy.
In accordance with that policy, when a wave of unofficial strikes occurred in 1941, the ringleaders were arrested and shot. The Nazis also made persistent efforts to introduce their ideology through school textbooks and directives. In February 1942, they attempted to organize all teachers and enforce national service for all young people along the lines of the Hitler Youth. The teachers refused to pledge loyalty to the regime, and 12,000 of the 14,000-strong profession openly protested at the youth program. 1,300 of them were arrested at random, and many were sent to concentration camps to suffer hard labor.
After 1 year, many had died, but they didn't give in. So the Germans and the Norwegian Nazis, was a few of them, they gave up to Nazified schools. They wanted the young schoolchildren to put in uniform, Nazi uniform, but they highly refused. They did never force it on the Norwegian population. And one thing was very strange, it was about more than 300,000 housewives. They wrote the letter and they said, we refuse that you take our children into Nazi uniform. So it was a fine job from a very important part of the population.
Amongst those most in danger from the Gestapo were the true Norwegians, who almost from the very start of the occupation were determined to preserve free speech and counter Nazi propaganda. Many of them contained news derived from broadcasts by the BBC, heard throughout Norway on illegal radios.
The people had been brave enough to keep their radios that took down the news. And they had a typewriter, and they had a piece of paper, and they copied this. And so it started actually what we call illegal newspapers, but it was actually secret newspapers with all world news. So in the first 2-3 years it went fairly well, but then in that period about more than 5,000 were discovered as newspaper people, and they were sent to Germany, concentration camps in Germany, to die more or less. And so many as 220 editors, newspaper reporters were killed, they were shot because they did this anti-propaganda.
As elsewhere, prison camps were a routine part of the apparatus of Nazi repression. There were over a dozen in Norway. The largest of these was Grini in the outskirts of Oslo, which also acted as a transit camp for prisoners on their way to camps in Germany or elsewhere. Approximately 50,000 Norwegians were arrested by the Germans during the occupation, 9,000 of whom were sent on to Germany. 1,400 of them died. More than half of these were Jews, around 40% of Norway's tiny Jewish population of 2,000.
Luckily, around 60% got away to Sweden, but some 760, 770 maybe, were actually arrested by the Nazis with, sadly enough, assistance from the Norwegian police. And they were all sent to German concentration camps, Auschwitz, most of them, and less than 30 survived.
The worst of the concentration camps inside Norway were those constructed in the far north in Finnmark, especially to hold Russian prisoners. Over 100,000 prisoners were held in appallingly primitive conditions and used for slave labor. After the war, 17,000 bodies were found. To support its soldiers in Russia, Germany requisitioned goods from the Norwegian population. Items such as blankets, boots, tents, rucksacks and wind cheaters had to be handed in. Failure to comply was punished by 3 years' imprisonment. Severe rationing was enforced, and the population came to depend on food parcels from Sweden and Denmark. On occasions, Danish soup was all that stood between Norway's children and starvation. Some items like leather goods disappeared altogether. Replacements included such things as paper shoes with wooden soles and fish scale handbags. It was a miserable time for ordinary people. As Nazi repression became more brutal, an increasing number of Norwegians looked to Sweden as a safe haven. In the early months of the war, Sweden had only preserved its neutrality and independence by coming to an accommodation with the Nazis. The Swedish government had even refused King Haakon safe passage through their country when Norway fell to the German invasion.
Certainly in the early days, you might well be interned if you escaped into Sweden, and there are certainly cases of German deserters being handed back to the German authorities. But I suppose the real importance of Sweden is it provides a refuge for the Norwegian resistance. If things are getting too hot, you can escape across that long and difficult to police border. And it was fairly easy, once you got to Stockholm, if you're important enough of course, to be shuttled back to Britain on a mosquito.
It was very important for Norway that Sweden was neutral. It was extremely valuable. And more than 50,000 Norwegians saved their lives getting out over the border to Sweden. And they were very well treated and taken care of in Sweden. But I would say 50,000 were saved because of a neutral Sweden.
Norway's long border with Sweden was matched to the west by an equally long coastline, some 2,650 kilometres, easily accessible from the Shetlands and the UK mainland. It provided a means for escape for some 3,300 Norwegians. Fishing boats carried most of them, but some smaller and less seaworthy craft were used, and around 3,000 were shipwrecked. The young Norwegians who escaped to Britain by boat or via Sweden formed the core of the wing of military resistance that carried on the fight from abroad and helped to give that government credibility in the eyes of the population at home. But it should not be forgotten that one section of the Norwegian population had been deeply involved in the struggle against the Nazis right from the start: the sailors of the Merchant Marine. When Germany invaded Norway, the Norwegian Merchant Marine consisted of 1,172 vessels, totaling more than 4.4 million tons. 252 of these, totaling almost 2 million tons, were tankers. At that time, agreements between Britain and Norway meant that Britain had already chartered nearly 2 million gross tons, including 60% of the tanker fleet. After the invasion, Quisling ordered all Norwegian ships to make for German, Italian or neutral ports. But the Norwegian government in London managed to requisition the fleet. thus gaining for itself a major bargaining chip with its British hosts and a substantial revenue earner throughout the war. What Britain gained was a lifeline.
We had the third biggest merchant fleet in the world. We had the most modern tanker fleet in the world, so we could supply London, England, when England had no supplies. The first 2 years of the war, that were more or less dependent on the Norwegian tankers. First of all, supplies of gasoline and oils. That was very important. They said our war started September 39 with our merchant navy, because they were torpedoed from that time on when they went to Allied harbors, which they did all the time.
Norwegian merchant ships played a major part in the Battle of the Atlantic and in all Allied seaborne operations throughout the war. The cost in lives and ships was appalling. In 1940, 216 ships were lost. In 1942, a Norwegian ship was lost every other day. By the end of the war, over 50% of the fleet had been lost, at a cost of 3,743 lives. With a legitimate government in London and young men flocking to join the fight, Norway's commitment to the Allied cause was not in any doubt. The problem that now faced the authorities in London and at home was how to organize an effective military resistance without jeopardizing the civilian population. For various reasons, this problem was to prove singularly difficult to overcome in the years that followed. The Resistance Museum in Oslo is housed in an old building in Akershus Castle next to a memorial that marks the spot where Norwegian patriots were executed by the German occupying forces. Their death was part of a bitterly hard learning process for a peace-loving population with no great military tradition and no experience of organized resistance to an invader.
Resistance had to be invented, had to be taught, had to be learned. The military organization, the Milorg, was formed gradually, and in the autumn of 1941 it was authorized by the Norwegian government in London.
Milorg was slow to expand and at first avoided action and even weapons, gradually building up a secret centralized army and preparing quietly for the day of liberation. Its intention was to go slow, lie low, and by not attracting attention, avoid placing the lives of ordinary citizens at risk.
There were, of course, difficulties. Norway was quite an open society. People weren't great at keeping secrets. This is certainly a theme that seems to run through British cooperation with the Norwegians. And the Gestapo did manage to penetrate certain groups on the west coast in 1941 with, roundups and arrests that follow. But I think by late 1941 this has been got over, and we see them moving towards something of a more effective, more homogeneous resistance movement.
Coordinating resistance under the harshly repressive Nazi regime was a severe challenge because Norway suffered the highest level of occupation of any country in Europe. 250,000 troops by 1942, rising to over 400,000 by the end of the war, 1 German for every 8 Norwegians. And in a country where bridges and ferry crossings create natural bottlenecks, policing the population through identity cards was comparatively easy.
I had to leave my home in Oslo, of course. I had a room rented there, and I had now different passports. I had to make a new passport in the name of Andersen instead of Sønsteby, and later on it was discovered by the secret police, and then I had to shift. So, and I stayed now from 42. I had almost 10 hideouts. So I had no difficulties to keep away from the Gestapo.
One way that Norwegians could make a serious contribution to the war was to supply intelligence to the Allies. For more urgent intelligence, there was a network of wireless operators, particularly along the coast. Their task was to watch the movements of the German fleet along Norway's jagged coastline.
Norway is only really important in British strategy when it comes to the German Navy, which virtually the entire surface fleet is based there. And for the British, the threat that this might initially break out into the Atlantic, later on attack the Arctic convoys, is of major significance.
This network, operated jointly by SIS and the Norwegian Intelligence Office in London, grew rapidly. Their most celebrated success was the sustained 2-year observation of the battleship Tirpitz as it moved from one hiding place to another. She was finally destroyed by bombing near Tromsø in 1944. Inland, Milorg set up a further 70 stations of its own, using secretly built equipment. And SOE had its own networks. All of them were highly vulnerable to sophisticated German direction-finding techniques. Records show that the Norwegian Intelligence Office in London handled nearly 6,000 radio reports and 20,000 reports by courier in the course of the war. The contribution these agents made to the eventual Allied victory is incalculable. Jens Anton Paulsen was among the thousands of young men who escaped from Norway and ended up in England looking for a chance to take the fight back to the enemy. He joined Norwegian Independent Company No. 1, known as the Martin Linge Company after its founder. Members of the company underwent rigorous fitness training and learnt sabotage techniques under the overall control of the Special Operations Executive, SOE.
I went through all the SOE courses, well, 2 or 3 at that time I think, and later on I believe I have been through most of the courses the SOE was running. Norwegian Independent Company No. 1. We got a very nice place in Scotland, in the Avonmore area, with the Cairngorm Mountains and country. It was very similar to Norway, very good place to stay and train for the Norwegians.
Many SOE-trained agents were on their way back to Norway via what became known as the Shetland Bus, a clandestine ferry operation consisting of fishing boats. It was an extremely hazardous operation, often undertaken in foul weather and heavy seas, and with the constant risk of capture or worse. SOE's Shetland base was also used to launch commando raids against German forces and installations in Norway. One such raid was the Claymore operation against the Lofoten Islands on the 4th of March 1941. Undertaken without the prior knowledge of the Norwegian government in London, who protested on behalf of their citizens who suffered reprisals, with homes burnt and people arrested. Norwegian commandos who had taken part in the raid felt disillusioned and began to doubt whether it was right to operate under British orders to achieve British military objectives. This view was compounded by the death of Martin Linge in the Anklet raid against Måløy in December 1941.
Milorg, of course, is operating under a philosophy that they are saving their strength for the day that the liberation comes, and thus can be an effective sort of secret army in support of any Allied landings in Norway. And they're husbanding their strength while SOE are coming in and causing trouble, which of course often leads to crackdowns, and that leads to tension between the two groups. Indeed, amongst SOE there is a belief that Milorg is a bunch of dangerous amateurs and should be avoided at all cost.
1942 was a bad year for Milorg. Many of its networks were penetrated, hundreds were arrested, 24 of its leaders and a number of innocent citizens were shot. The setbacks brought about a wholesale revision of Milorg's strategy. The choice was stark. It could remain poorly trained, poorly equipped and vulnerable, or it could become a decentralized, fully trained and armed guerrilla organization. For that, it needed London's help. The most famous action involving SOE-trained soldiers of the Linger Company was the Genocide operation against the heavy water plant at Vemork in February 1943. It was vital to Norwegian interests that the attack should be carried out by saboteurs, because a bombing raid would be hazardous to the local population. A four-man team, codenamed Grouse, was dropped onto the nearby Hardanger Plateau by parachute on the 18th of October 1942 to make contact with SOE's undercover agent working at the plant, Einar Schinneland, codenamed Swallow.
We were dropped quite a long way from the operational area, and that was because we were going to drop blind. There was no reception committee on the ground, so I wanted to be quite sure that we wouldn't get in touch with any German patrols and so on. It took us 14 days to move that short distance because of all the equipment we had to bring with us.
The plan was for Grouse to base itself in a commandeered skiing hut and prepare for a glider-borne commando attack that was scheduled to occur a month after their arrival. 34 Royal Engineers were to make the commando raid. Its codename was Freshman. In the event, it was a catastrophe. Both gliders crashed, one near Leisefjord and the other near Egersund. The few survivors of the impact, many of them badly wounded, were rounded up by the Gestapo, tortured and shot.
The Freshman operation was a disaster. They were very unlucky. One of the problems was that the lights we have got, there was ordinary British Army flashlights, and I think they weren't good enough. Later in the war we used more powerful lights. So if you had good lights who spread their beam better, I'm sure they would have found us.
The Grouse team were ordered to remain in place to prepare for a second attempt. They withdrew up into the wilderness of the Hardanger Plateau, out of reach of German patrols, to await orders. In the event, they were forced to survive the incredibly harsh conditions for another 4 months. For days on end, they would be pinned down in their hut by howling wind and driving snow. On more than one occasion, they came close to starvation.
The most important was to stay alive. And that meant wood for our stove in the hut we had chosen. And it meant food. The day before Christmas, I shot the first reindeer, and we spent a very, very nice Christmas eating.
Back in London, it was decided not to try another commando raid, but to send in a second small team of SOE-trained Norwegians to complete the job. Their leader was Second Lieutenant Joachim Rønneberg. The operation was codenamed Genocide. On the 16th of February, after many delays and flights aborted by bad weather, the 6-man team dropped onto the Hardanger Plateau. It was 6 days before they made contact with the Grouse team.
The problem was, when we got a message that they had landed, a tremendous snowstorm broke up. So we were very anxious about them. After a week, the weather cleared and went up to Lake Kallungsjön to look up for them, and I met them. So it was a very happy reunion. We all knew each other from England, from Scotland.
The combined party quickly decided that the best line of attack was to drop down into the gorge, cross the ice-bound river at the bottom, and attempt to climb the sheer cliff on the other side. A route that is still considered to be treacherous today. But despite the dangers, this route was their only means of escape. So they would have to complete the operation without alerting any of the German guards. On the day of the attack, Hellberg, one of the gunnerside team, recce'd the route and declared it possible. The only problem was that a thaw had set in.
Because of the mild weather, there was quite a lot of water in the river, and there was only one ice bridge to cross at that place. If that had also had gone, we must have looked for another place, and that would have been very difficult.
The wet snow made the going hard, and in the bottom of the gorge the rapidly thawing ice cracked and groaned as they made their way across the river. By 1:45 they were safely out of the gorge and hiding only a few hundred yards from their objective, the looming bulk of the Vemork plant. At 3 a.m. they made their silent assault, cutting through the thick chain lock on the giant wire mesh gates and taking up their positions in the compound. Two members of the demolition team, Röneberg and Kaiser, made their way along a narrow cable shaft and dropped down into the cellar where the machinery that concentrated the heavy water was situated. There they overpowered the Norwegian night watchman, and Röneberg set about placing explosives on the cylinders of water. 25 minutes later, they released the night watchman and burst out of the steel door of the cellar into the night. A few seconds later, they heard the dull thud of the explosion. The sound was muffled by the noise of the factory and the thick concrete walls. In that moment, Hitler's atomic scientists lost 3,000 pounds of heavy water, about 4 months' production. At the sound of the explosion, the door of the nearby German barracks hut swung open and a half-dressed soldier appeared, flashing a torch. The beam passed inches above the head of one of the hiding saboteurs. After listening for a while, the sentry turned and walked slowly back to his hut.
Today we know the reason why no shot was fired was because the Germans didn't do that job. The German guards didn't do that job. But we were very, very lucky. I believe the British, as a saying, you get what luck you deserve. Maybe we deserved it, I don't know. But at least we were very, very, very lucky.
Once safe in the mountains, the party split up. Some of them were to stay in Norway, while 5 were to make an epic 400-kilometer journey across the Hardangervidda to the Swedish border. It was several days before London learnt that the raid had been a complete success. SOE was jubilant, as was Downing Street. But more than anything else, it was a huge victory for Norway and those of its citizens who had chosen to resist the German tyranny. The Germans worked frantically to repair the damaged machinery at Vemork. The SOE undercover agent Schinneland told London that the plant would be back in full production by August. Once again, the Americans raised the possibility of bombing the plant, and this time the plan was accepted, but only because the Norwegian government and High Command were not told about it. On the 16th of November, a fleet of 300 flying fortresses and liberators took off from East Anglia and headed for Vemork. Only 18 of them hit the plant. The heavy water high concentration cells escaped almost intact. 22 local citizens were killed. The Norwegian authorities in London were incandescent with rage. The Germans decided to remove all remaining stocks of heavy water to Germany in February 1944. On Sunday the 24th of February, Norwegian saboteurs placed a bomb in the bow of the hydro ferry that would transport the rail wagons containing the heavy water across Lake Tinsha on Sunday the 20th of February. The bomb exploded as planned at 10:45, sending the ferry and its cargo to the bottom. Sadly, 14 Norwegian passengers were drowned. But once again, the point had been proved that a small team of highly motivated and well-trained Norwegian saboteurs could achieve what a massive bombing raid could not.
Once the British and Americans, who of course are quite well developed on their atomic project at this time, discover the Germans are working on the same thing, this has to be stopped. And of course we should remember, Heisenberg, the head of the German atomic bomb project's biographer, actually says the Vemork raid limits the Germans to small-scale reactor experiments. They're not thinking about building a bomb after the raid.
In the final phase of the war, the Norwegian military resistance organisation, Milorg, finally came into its own. With the aid of London, it had gradually been building up its strength.
In early December 1944, a directive was issued by General Eisenhower. The idea was to keep the Germans in Norway. And in order to do that, one should sabotage against railways, shipping and fuel facilities to slow down the transfer of German troops from occupied Norway to the continent. So the Milorg got the opportunity to carry out sabotage.
This actually happened after the German surrender in Finland in the autumn of 1944, when large numbers of troops were withdrawn into Finnmark and thence southwards.
The Allies didn't have any forces to use in Norway at that time. So if he had wanted to fight on, it would have taken a hell of a long time to eliminate him.
In the event, General Burma signed the German surrender in Norway on the 8th of May 1945, and Milorg did not have to fight. Their role in the risky transition period was to stand guard, protect buildings and maintain order. And there was also the matter of rounding up the traitors and collaborationists. Unlike France, which saw a massive bloodletting after the liberation, Norway handled the matter with dignity and due process. Some 25 traitors, including Quisling, were executed. On June the 7th, 1945, 5 years to the day after he had been forced into exile, King Haakon VII set foot on Norwegian soil again. Norway's long nightmare was over. On the 1st of September 1939, at 4:45 a.m., 9 German columns rolled across Poland's western border in an act of undeclared war. By launching the invasion, Hitler breached the solemn undertaking he had given the Western powers at Munich a year before. He had sworn to make no further territorial demands after Czechoslovakia. It was a promise he never intended to keep. Now, 1 year on, the great lie was exposed. The invasion of Poland followed months of mounting aggression. Hitler had demanded the return of Danzig, the Baltic port ceded to Poland after World War I, together with the right to construct rail and motorway links from Germany through the Polish corridor to East Prussia. Poland refused. On the 22nd of August 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. 3 days later, Poland and Britain signed a mutual protection pact. On the 29th, Germany delivered an ultimatum to Poland. Negotiations between the two countries broke down on the final day of August. In the small hours of the following morning, the invasion began. 2 days later, the French and British governments declared war on Germany, triggering a cataclysm that engulfed the whole of Europe before spreading across the globe. Poland was the first country to experience German blitzkrieg, lightning war. It had been made possible by the development of mechanized troop transport, highly mobile firepower in the form of the Panzer tank, Stuka dive bombers to destroy enemy defenses, and Messerschmitt fighters to win command of the air. It was a war of continuous movement, no front formed for more than a few hours. The Polish army at the time numbered 1.7 million troops, double the size of the invading forces. But it had far less modern equipment, while Germany could command 2,600 tanks and over 2,000 aircraft. The defending forces were deployed in frontier zones to protect vital industrial resources and in the Polish corridor. In the event, General von Bock's 3rd and 4th armies spearheaded in from both sides and cut the Polish forces to shreds before turning south. The 8th, 10th and 14th armies struck northeast from Slovakia and Silesia. In a move that prefigured his Panzer sickle cut across France 8 months later, Heinz Guderian's tanks raced south from Prussia, covering 200 miles in 10 days, always risking attack from the east and finally making contact with the Southern Army Group on the 17th of September. The Polish army was caught inside a double pincer. On the same day, 2 Soviet army groups invaded from White Russia in the north and the Ukraine in the south. In a secret annex to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler had agreed with the Soviet Union to split Poland down the middle. The Poles were completely wrong-footed. They had very few forces left to stem the Soviet advance. These included cadets who had been sent east for training when war broke out.
Dotarliśmy tam po bardzo męczących marszach, bo przecież młodzi chłopcy w pełnym uzbrojeniu, z karabinami, z całym wyposażeniem wojskowym. Robiliśmy niekiedy po 30-40 kilometrów marszów dziennie. Tam żeśmy się dowiedzieli, przyszliśmy tam, to był już 17 września i 17 września zamiast na spokojnym terenie, na którym mieliśmy być przygotowywani, dowiedzieliśmy się, że Sowieci zaatakowali Polskę z drugiej strony, a myśmy się znaleźli na pierwszej linii frontu. Walczyliśmy z oddziałami sowieckimi. Sowieci bombardowali nas z samolotów. Musieliśmy się wycofywać z powrotem na zachód.
The Russian forces met little resistance and over 200,000 Poles surrendered to the Red Army. For another week, the Poles held out against the Wehrmacht. In Warsaw, 100,000 troops and 800,000 civilians kept the Germans at bay. The bombers of the Luftwaffe and the combined firepower of 4 German armies, some 2,500 artillery pieces, pounded the city. On September the 27th, the city surrendered. Poland's allies looked on helplessly and asked themselves whether it was the end.
Actually, in many ways, it was the beginning. Not only resistance to occupation, but also exile forces fighting abroad. But in particular, even as Warsaw was in its dying embers of resistance in 1939, efforts were being made to organize a resistance movement. And with 100 plus years of foreign occupation from the final partitions in the 18th century, the Poles developed some considerable skills in conspiratorial work. And these skills were once again going to be brought to play during the German and the Soviet occupations.
For the fourth time in its history, Poland had been divided up between Germany and Russia. Germany now possessed 72,500 square miles of the country, an area containing most of the mines and factories and 23 million citizens. Western territories, including Danzig, Poznań, Łódź and Katowice, were incorporated directly into Germany. The central part, including Warsaw, Lublin, Kraków and Lwów, became what was known as the general government. Russia seized the remainder of the country, an area that contained 12 million Poles and most of Poland's oil resources. But it had not been a cheap victory. The Poles had resisted with far greater courage and vigour than the German High Command had anticipated. A quarter of German tanks had been lost, while the Luftwaffe had written off over 500 aircraft. 16,000 German troops had been killed, with a further 32,000 wounded. Most important of all, the spirit of the Poles was unbroken. Just a week before the invasion of Poland, Hitler had secretly advised his senior commanders of his intention to kill, without pity or mercy, all men, women and children of Polish race or language. In the wake of the regular army units came the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, the special force tasked with systematically murdering doctors, university lecturers, officers, landowners, churchmen, local government officials, Jews and aristocrats. Within a week, SS commanders were boasting of 200 shootings a day.
At the beginning, it was quite clear that German occupation policies were going to have a genocidal flavor. Poland, of course, was one of the places where the Holocaust would take place, largely because of the numbers of resident Jewish people in Poland. But for Poles themselves, they were also a significant target of Nazi racial policies. And the aim was, in essence, to decapitate the society, take away the intelligentsia, the leadership element of society.
A complex of concentration camps was constructed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, an hour's journey from Kraków. Polish political prisoners were its first inmates. As well as non-Jewish Poles, it's been estimated that in the course of the war well over 1 million Jews were killed at Auschwitz. The camp records were destroyed by the Nazis, but for Poles and Jews, and many who would regard themselves as both, Auschwitz remains a harrowing memorial to the most appalling human suffering. Two million of Poland's 3.3 million Jews had been trapped in the western areas of the country that had been reincorporated into Germany. 600,000 of these, as well as Jews from Austria and Czechoslovakia, were shipped back into the central general government area in cattle trucks. They were concentrated in ghettos in the larger towns and cities, surrounded by brick walls and barbed wire. There, they were to await a final solution. Starting in February 1940, well over 1 million Poles were deported to the Soviet Union. The fate of many of these is still unknown. Others were deported to Germany to provide labor to fuel the Nazi war economy. Behind the systematic killings and the forced migrations was a plan to create a slave state. The Poles showed remarkable resilience in the face of the rape of their country and the brutal and systematic assault on their culture and identity. Resistance began immediately, and it involved the whole population at every level. Collaboration with the occupying power was extremely rare.
Nie pamiętam, bo od tego momentu dzieli mnie już 60 lat życia, ale wtedy wejście do konspiracji w latach 40. w okresie wojennego bezprawia wprowadzonego przez okupanta, opór był rzeczą naturalną. To było we krwi każdego młodego człowieka, każdej młodej dziewczyny wówczas. I nie było żadnym powodem do chwały. Raczej dziwne byłoby, gdyby się tego nie robiło. Było to tak naturalne jak uczenie się, studiowanie, czytanie. Było to tak naturalne, jak w nienaturalnych okolicznościach toczyło się życie w Polsce.
With no legitimate Polish government in the country to rally and organize them, Poles organized themselves. Their passion to defend their freedom was boundless. With little or no outside help, they set up a network of groups that were later to unite under the banner of the Armia Krajowa, or AK, the Home Army. The Home Army's organizational structure covered the whole of Poland, but there were a few groups that remained independent. In Lublin province, units of the Communist People's Guard and the right-wing National Armed Forces were reluctant to recognize the Home Army's authority, as were some Jewish detachments and some partisan groups in Lithuania, Belarus and the Ukraine. And in the border region there were Russian partisan units who owed their allegiance to Moscow. Nevertheless, the extent of the unification achieved was remarkable and far-reaching.
The diversity of resistance included partisan activity, it included sabotage, assassination, intelligence collection. It's safe to say that the Polish resistance organization, which eventually was known by the broad umbrella name of the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was in fact probably Europe's most organized and sophisticated resistance movement in the Second World War.
A Polish government in exile had set itself up in Paris, and after the invasion of France in May 1940, it shifted to London, taking with it around 20,000 escaped Polish soldiers and airmen. After some bitter political infighting, Władysław Rakiewicz emerged as president, with Władysław Sikorski as prime minister and leader of the Polish Free Forces. Sikorski was a charismatic leader who was also free of the taint of the unpopular right-wing pre-war government. He immediately began planning for the moment when Poles would take back their country.
At the end of the day, decisions taken in Poland were ultimately going to have to be taken by the leadership of the underground. As they were on the scene, they were more directly connected to the situation on the ground. And because of this, there were sometimes tensions between the exile government and the underground. But by and large, they followed, it seems to me, a central purpose. And that central purpose was for the underground to contribute to the Allied war effort, and in particular to the liberation of Poland.
When the uprising began, it was to be sudden, explosive and totally committed. Above all, it had to be victorious. Soldiers were recruited and trained against the day when they would be needed to wrest Poland back from the invader.
W momencie, kiedy przekształcono nas już w Armię Krajową, wtedy znalazłem się w pułku, który przyjął pseudonim Baszta. Mieliśmy szkoły podoficerskie dla młodzieży, która jeszcze w wojsku nie była. Mieliśmy szkoły podchorążych tajne, w których jeszcze wszyscy uzupełniali swoją wiedzę. Część treningu, czy jak to nazwać, odbywaliśmy w partyzantce w lasach otaczających Warszawę. Tam były ćwiczenia terenowe.
Before the end of 1939, the Polish resistance had an efficient bureau of information and propaganda in place. One of its tasks was to print underground newspapers. There were dozens of other Home Army titles, achieving a total daily circulation of 200,000 copies. But it was not all serious. Song sheets and light reading matter were also produced.
A sama miałam pod swoją opieką literaturę piękną. Rzeczywiście, że ona była bardzo piękna, bo to były szmatławe broszurki, takie kryminały jakieś straszliwe. I ludzie się nieraz potem dziwili, że ja nie lubię czytać kryminałów. No tak już powoli, ale nie mogę, nie znoszę, bo po prostu to mi się przypomina, te szmaty.
The process of creating and issuing false identity papers was known as legalization. Underground activity often called for a complete change of identity, requiring a large number of different documents. Between September 1943 and March 1944, the Legalization Department issued thousands of fake IDs, employment certificates, birth certificates, and other documents relating to transport, residence, and travel. The Nazis had set out to utterly obliterate Poland, and the resistance reacted by assuming responsibility for all spheres of civilian life, including the courts, publishing, protection of cultural relics, theatre, and education.
Bo pamiętajmy, że Niemcy zamknęli nie tylko wyższe uczelnie, ale licea, a nawet i szkoły zawodowe. Także istniały tylko szkoły powszechne, no więc nauczanie oczywiście poszło wyżej. Znane były te komplety dzieci, które zbierały się w domach, w grupach jakichś kilku czy kilkunastoosobowych. No i od pierwszej klasy takiej gimnazjalnej spokojnie dochodziły do matury. I to do matur na wysokim poziomie.
As well as functioning as teachers, nurses, editors, publishers, secretaries, liaison officers, and in a host of other capacities, women were recruited into the Home Army in large numbers to act as couriers, operating between the different groups throughout Poland.
Przechowywały broń, materiały w skrytkach specjalnie robionych, ale i zwyczajnie pod materacem. Jedna z moich koleżanek, nieżyjąca, Janina Palmowska-Frankowska, woziła materiały wywiadu zwyczajnie pod materacykiem Wojtka, który miał wtedy tam x miesięcy czy potem roczek.
Women were subject to arrest and torture by the Gestapo no less than their male colleagues in the resistance. Nobody was safe. In Gestapo headquarters at Aleja Szucha, people were tortured indiscriminately on the basis that they might possibly blurt out information. Those who survived often found themselves incarcerated in the infamous Pawiak prison. After a botched attempt to lay their hands on German weapons, Jan Gołębiowski and two of his colleagues were thrown into cell 222 at the Pawiak.
Niemcy przesłuchiwali. Staliśmy w kolejce, czołem oparci o mur ściany, z rękami założonymi do tyłu. No i po kolei nas wzywali. No, oczekiwanie było bardzo, skromnie mówiąc, nieprzyjemne, bo ten oczekujący słyszał bicie, krzyki, wycie mordowanego człowieka. No i później po iluś tam minutach flag takiego człowieka Niemcy wyciągali z kancelarii, rzucali na korytarz.
Gołębiowski survived the day, but later witnessed the horrifying reprisals taken by the SS and the Gestapo in the wake of an attempted jailbreak by prisoners in another cell block. The plan had been betrayed, and the escaping prisoners were mown down by SS troops who had been waiting for them. On the following day, further measures were taken.
Okienko w celi, to w tej chwili jest takie, było, tylko nie było szyb. Mnie podsadził jeden z współwięźniów i widziałem, jak na podwórku, na dziedzińcu więzienia stali więźniowie z oddziału 3 i Niemcy razem z jakimś cywilem, który palcem wskazywał wśród więźniów osoby, wybierali te osoby i co się okazało później rozstrzelali. Chyba na początku sto kilkudziesięciu, a później prawie wszystkich więźniów z oddziału 3.
Informers and collaborators were ruthlessly eliminated by Home Army hit squads carrying out the sentences of underground courts. But their principal targets were Nazi functionaries, in particular SS and Gestapo personnel. Poland's intelligence capabilities were rated extremely highly by London, not least because substantial numbers of her citizens had been conscripted into the German army or to work in factories inside Germany. Together with the home population, they were a rich source of information.
Perhaps the most famous was collecting pieces of a V-2 rocket which landed in eastern Poland, having bits eventually flown back to Britain for examination, and other parts of it producing detailed drawings for Allied scientists.
On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler turned on his ally Stalin and launched his forces across the Soviet border. Over 3 million German soldiers and 3,300 tanks were involved in the eastward thrust. Operation Barbarossa, as the invasion was called, fatally committed Hitler to a war on 2 fronts. Ultimately, the decision would bring about the fall of the Reich. But in the early stages, the German army swept all before it. In Poland, the Russian occupation forces were rolled back across the border, leaving Germany in control of the whole country.
This actually had a significant impact on the effectiveness of the underground in particularly eastern areas, because the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was actually rather effective in dealing with Polish resistance as compared to their German counterparts. I think that's one major effect. But it also politically created circumstances now where the Polish exile government and, in theory, the resistance were fighting alongside the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. And politically, this was quite a momentous event, leading, in fact, to a rapprochement between the Polish exile government and also the Soviet Union.
Russia released some Polish prisoners of war as a token of good faith. Others were recruited into a Polish army under Russian control. But the Polish government harbored no illusions about Soviet ambitions, and the rapprochement did not last. Radio Berlin was quick to seize on the discovery by German troops of a mass grave in the Kutyn forest near Smolensk in January 1943. It contained the bodies of 4,143 Polish officers who had been interned by the Russians in a prison camp at Kozelsk in 1939. Nazi propaganda blamed the Russian secret police, the NKVD, for the massacre. The Russians denied the charge and blamed the Nazis. The gruesome discovery was enough to drive a wedge between the Poles and the Russians and cut short diplomatic relations between the two countries. 1943 was also marked by tragedy, for the resistance, which lost 2 of its leaders, and for the country as a whole, when Hitler embarked on the so-called final solution to the Jewish problem. It was an era of monstrous evil and extraordinary heroism. The 350,000 Jewish residents of Warsaw constituted nearly a third of the city's pre-war population. It was the largest Jewish community in Europe and second only to that of New York. In October 1940, Berlin had ordered that all Jews should be concentrated into ghettos. Warsaw's was enclosed by a 10-foot wall topped with barbed wire and sealed off from the rest of the city. The Nazis saw the ghettos as temporary holding pens until a final solution to the Jewish problem could be resolved. Consequently, they took no account of the problems of massive overcrowding, poor sanitation, hunger, and disease.
Tens of thousands of Jewish people in the ghettos in Poland died in the very cruel winter of 1940-1941. And Jewish resistance in this period of the history of the ghettos includes such things as smuggling. Young kids would smuggle food into the ghetto. They would burrow under the walls. They would go over the walls. People who went out of the ghettos on work details, working for Germans in factories and forced labour outside the ghettos, would engage in illicit trade and bring black market food back into the ghetto to help people survive.
In January 1942, the Nazis adopted a policy of systematic extermination of the Jews. Camps were established at Bergek, Sobibor, Majdanek and Treblinka that had a combined capacity for killing over 80,000 Jews a day. Between the end of July and the beginning of October 1942, 310,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to these extermination camps. Many were rounded up here at Umschlagplatz, Appalled by the stories filtering back from the death camps, young Jewish socialists and Zionists vowed that they would not go like lambs to the slaughter. They built a network of bunkers and tunnels from which to fight when the Nazis returned. Only a small number of Jews were smuggled out of the ghetto.
I think it is safe to say on balance that it's inevitably going to be one of the more controversial areas in Polish-Jewish relations, one in which I think perhaps the Poles could have been their brother's keeper more. But bearing in mind the risks of harboring a Jew in Poland during occupation conditions were very severe sanctions. And I think it's a credit to those people who did take the risk to be their brother's keeper under those circumstances.
In January 1943, Himmler gave instructions for Warsaw to be Jew-free by Hitler's birthday on the 20th of April. 3,000 SS troops under General Jürgen Stroop were sent into the ghetto with orders to exterminate all Jews within 3 days. The streets were empty, but the Jews were waiting for them.
They suddenly encountered a fusillade of pistol fire, rifle shots, grenades being thrown down from balconies, rooftops, windows. They suffered casualties and they were stunned and retreated with dead and wounded out of the ghetto. Of course, they came back in greater force, but the fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto went on until the middle of May, before the Nazi commander Jürgen Stroop proudly announced that the Warsaw Ghetto is no more. German troops had to use artillery, flamethrowers, explosive demolition charges to destroy the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. The fighting went on for a month. The Germans couldn't believe the strength of the resistance.
56,000 Jews died in the fighting. But the Jewish will to resist was not broken, and survivors of the ghetto battles later fought alongside the Home Army in the Warsaw Uprising. From an international perspective, the Ghetto Uprising forced many who were ignorant or indifferent to the Nazi treatment of Jews to face reality. There was a determined effort by the Council for the Rescue of Jews to hide and spirit away Jewish children. In the course of the war, over 100,000 Polish Jews were rescued. Among the Polish forces who had escaped the invasion in 1939 were those who volunteered for service with the Special Operations Executive, SOE. As Britain's first ally in the war, the Polish section of SOE was especially favoured, operating its own radio stations in Britain and planning its own operations. The agents were known as Cichociemni, the silent and unseen. The arrival of the Cichociemni was always a huge boost to the morale of the Polish underground. On a practical level, they brought weapons and kits for making more, along with plans, orders, and huge quantities of money to finance resistance activities.
Summa summarum ponad 28 milionów, przepraszam bardzo, dolarów zostało przewiezione przez skoczków spadochronowych. Ja sam osobiście, lądując w kraju, miałem w pasach specjalnie przygotowanych około 45 000 dolarów. Chciałbym podkreślić, że przez cały czas wszystkich operacji cichociemnych nie zdarzył się jeszcze ani razu wypadek, żeby jakiekolwiek pieniądze, że tak powiem, przepadły. To też świadczy również o pewnego rodzaju dyscyplinie i uczciwości.
In July 1943, Stefan Rowecki, leader of the resistance forces in Warsaw, was captured and incarcerated. He was later killed on Himmler's orders. It was the second major blow to the Polish resistance in the course of a few days. On the 4th of the month, General Sikorski had also been killed. He was en route from a conference in the Middle East to London when the plane in which he was travelling crashed inexplicably on the airfield at Gibraltar. Conspiracy theorists, who included Stalin, pointed the finger at Churchill for Sikorski's death. Sikorski had given credibility to the government in exile, both in Poland and in the councils of her powerful allies. And he had held together by sheer force of personality a political coalition that began to fray after his death. The core problem was the question of the Soviet Union and Stalin's intentions. The fear was that he aimed to turn Poland into a Soviet state.
By 1943, there are strong indications that this is in fact what Stalin's intentions were. He was beginning to groom an alternative set of Polish political leadership, communist leadership, that on the Red Army entering Poland would establish a government in the provincial town of Lublin. Similarly, a communist army was also being developed. These were Poles who had been often deported into the Soviet Union, who formed the rank and file of Stalin's Polish army.
The Polish plan, codenamed Operation Tempest, was for Home Army units to launch local insurrections in support of the advancing Red Army. The hope was these units would establish equality with the Russians and retain control of liberated areas in the east. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Home Army would be holding itself in readiness for the uprising against the Germans.
In fact, it didn't work. The Soviet Union the frontline forces would take advantage of the assistance, but then very quickly afterwards, these Home Army units would be arrested. Sometimes the leaders of these units would be shot, and the rank and file would be incorporated into Stalin's Polish army that by 1943 had been developing on the Eastern Front. So for the Polish underground, Tempest operations were a bitter experience.
The failure of Operation Tempest was to reach its tragic culmination in the Warsaw Uprising in the late summer of 1944. Of all the tasks undertaken by the Home Army, one was paramount: to rise up against the German invader and wrest back control of the country. The decisive lunge for independence had to be made in a very narrow window when Nazi Germany verged on collapse and before the Red Army arrived in Warsaw. At the end of the third week of July 1944, with the Russians on the banks of the Vistula, the German military command packed its bags and ran. It appeared to be the decisive moment. But then, on July the 26th, the German High Command ordered the Wehrmacht to stand firm and build fortifications. Reinforcements in the form of the SS Viking Panzer Division and the Hermann Göring SS Panzer and Paratroop Division rolled into Warsaw. With Russian infantry 100 kilometers south of Warsaw and Russian tanks only 16 kilometers away near Wołomin, the Home Army could wait no longer. London agreed. The start of the uprising was set for 5 p.m. on August the 1st. At this point, the Home Army comprised 38,000 troops.
1 sierpnia dowiedziałem się o tym, że mam się stawić o godzinie 2 w punkcie, w którym zbierał się pluton, do którego należałem. Pamiętam, kiedy szedłem przez Warszawę, bo ten punkt był w zupełnie innej części miasta, a nie chciałem mieć jakiejś zwłoki, więc szedłem na piechotę, wyszedłem odpowiednio wcześnie. Nastrój na ulicy był kompletnie niepowtarzalny. Unosiło się coś w powietrzu. I drugi raz w życiu, kiedy wyczułem w powietrzu tę samą atmosferę, miał miejsce wtedy, kiedy po raz pierwszy polski papież przyjechał do Polski w okresie głębokiej jeszcze władzy PRL-owskiej. To był ten sam nastrój oczekiwania, świadomość tego, że stanie się coś wielkiego.
Less than 10% of Poles involved in the uprising were armed, and there was ammunition for only 7 days' fighting. Earlier in the war, Jan Gołębiowski had been thrown into the Pawiak prison for trying to buy 4 Schmeisser machine pistols. He was released in time to fight during the uprising.
Żałuję do chwili obecnej, że nie udało się kupić tych 4 Schmeisserów. To była dosyć pokaźna siła ognia. Aczkolwiek moja kompania, a moja kompania to była Koszta, czyli kompania ochrony sztabu Komendy Obszaru Warszawskiego, była dobrze uzbrojona, jak na warunki powstańcze, bo mój pluton dysponował 2 RKM-ami, 6 pistoletami maszynowymi, tam 15 karabinami w pierwszym dniu powstania, w pierwszych chwilach. Resztę pistolety, nie mieliśmy tylko granatów. Ale te 4 szmajsery by nam się bardzo, bardzo przydały.
The Poles fought ferociously, and at first the Home Army carried all before it, forcing the Germans back street by street, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, district by district. On building after building, the hated swastika was torn down to be replaced by the Polish flag. Tadeusz de Virian's platoon occupied the evangelical cemetery at Wola.
Pamiętam zresztą, jak kiedyś był poważny obstrzał artyleryjski i ci, którzy mogli, chronili się do grobów. Tam, gdzie udawało się otworzyć kapliczki grobowe, schodzili po schodkach i między trumnami czyli się najzupełniej bezpiecznie, bo tam nie docierały pociski. A o ile chodzi o czołgi. Czołgi nie tylko jeździły gdzieś daleko, ale przejeżdżały koło muru cmentarnego i wtedy miałem ochotę użyć określenia jak zabawa. Rzucało się w czołgi butelkami z benzyną, które miały rozpalić ogień na czołgach i w ten sposób doprowadzić do ich zniszczenia.
The battle dragged on for 63 days. It would not have lasted that long had the insurgents not scored remarkable successes in capturing German equipment, vehicles and weapons. And all the while around them, Warsavians were witnessing the destruction of their beautiful city. Himmler gave the order, all inhabitants of Warsaw to be shot, no prisoners to be taken, the city is to be razed to the ground. Systematically, Warsaw was reduced to rubble. Long before the end, food and water ran out.
W ogóle trzeba było się utrzymać tym, co się miało w zapasach, więc dzielili się ludzie jedni z drugimi. No najbardziej może małe dzieci, prawda, odczuwały. No ja właściwie nie miałam nawet czasu nad tym się zastanawiać, dlatego że ja musiałam być do dyspozycji i, prawda, opatrywać rannych, po prostu przenosić meldunki. Nocami dużo rzeczy się robiło. Nie było nawet czasu na normalny odpoczynek. Zresztą gdzie? Przecież w ogóle życie się odbywało raczej w piwnicach, bo stale były obstrzały, prawda, Niemców. Światła już nie mieliśmy przez cały okres okupacji powstaniowej. W ogóle elektrownia nie pracowała, także gotowało się na takich 2 cegłach wodę, jeszcze woda wtedy była.
Civilians were flushed from their homes and shot. The bodies were doused in petrol and burnt. Streets of houses were set ablaze. The sewers became a hidden network for insurgents to move about the city. The Germans responded by blocking manholes, tossing in grenades, and occasionally fighting the survivors in hand-to-hand combat amidst the filth.
Between 200 and 250,000 people perished, civilians perished in the course of the uprising. The brutality that the Germans displayed, particularly between the 5th and the 7th of August, massacring so many civilians, essentially drove them into areas held by the Home Army because they felt this was the only place they could have any safety. It's best epitomized if one goes to Warsaw in the Old Town. There's a monument to the children of the Warsaw Uprising, and it's in fact one of the most moving monuments to the uprising, and I think it captures the pathos of what happened to the civilian population during those terrible 2 months.
To this day, it's still a cause of great bitterness that the Soviet Union stood by while Warsaw went up in flames. Some units of the Red Army reached the suburbs while battle raged, but Stalin had ordered them to halt. He had made a cynical calculation that once the two sides had killed each other off, the Red Army could move in.
Inną pomoc w ostatnich już dniach dostawaliśmy pseudopomoc ze Związku Radzieckiego. Nad Warszawą latały tak zwane kukurużniki i z tych kukurużników zrzucano w workach amunicję i karabiny i jakieś suchary i to wszystko jak spadało na ziemię, to się rozbijało na marmoladę i było ani do spożycia, ani do walki nie można było tego użyć.
In the end, the Poles simply ran out of the arms and equipment they needed to continue the fight. The Home Army capitulated and was allowed to march out in formation into the hands of the waiting Germans. Large-scale Polish resistance effectively ended. In the aftermath of the Warsaw Uprising, the Germans went about the systematic destruction of virtually everything left standing, while the Russians, who were preparing for their next offensive, watched impassively. Civilians were driven out of the city. Well over 100,000 were sent as slave labour to the factories of the Reich. Tens of thousands were sent to concentration camps. In the areas occupied by the Soviet army, the centre of political power shifted to the small city of Lublin, 160 kilometres southeast of Warsaw, where the ruling political committee consisted of communists who took their orders from Moscow. They ruthlessly set about dismantling any remnants of the old Polish Republic and suppressing opposition to the regime. The Home Army was depicted as being full of fascist reactionaries who were acting against civil law. After the capitulation of Warsaw, 200,000 members of the Home Army remained under arms in Poland, commanded by General Leopold Okulicki, codenamed Bear Cub. They continued to harass the German forces wherever they could. Largely abandoned by their allies in the West, denounced as bandits and fascist by Moscow and its stooges within Poland, they became increasingly isolated and vulnerable to the Red Army as it began its advance westwards to Berlin.
Powstawała następna konspiracja już skierowana przeciwko okupantowi rosyjskiemu, który wkroczył w tym czasie w granice Polski i od razu rozpoczął prześladowania akowców. Łapano nas na ulicach, aresztowano. Wkrótce Bogdan Kunert, mój przyjaciel, i mój drugi przyjaciel podchorąży Sławomir Malczewski zostali zastrzeleni przez rosyjskich żołnierzy. Oczywiście w tej sytuacji nie było żadnej mowy o czym innym, jak o ukrywaniu się dalej i byciu w konspiracji.
On the 19th of January 1945, the formal order was given to dissolve the Home Army. The fate of the Poles was already sealed. The Western Allies had already tacitly accepted Moscow's insistence on a post-war carve-up of the country along the Nazi-Soviet peace boundary of 1939, known as the Curzon Line. Territories east of the Bug River were to be ceded to the Soviet Union. And the west of the country was effectively under the control of Zhukov's forces that finally crossed the border into Germany at the end of January 1945.
Kolega ze szkoły został wywieziony, wtedy schwytany w Krakowie na ulicy, wywieziony aż za Morze Kaspijskie do obozu, właściwie do obozu śmierci, z którego mało kto wyszedł. Szczęśliwie on przeżył. Na prawo i lewo wtedy widziało się wywożenie wszystkiego z kraju, co się dało wywieźć, i armia sowiecka przecież zachowywała się tak jak okupacyjna. Było to jasne dla nas, że nadeszła nowa okupacja, zresztą nie tylko dla nas akowców, ale dla całej ludności, z którą się spotykałem wtedy. Wszyscy byli wtedy przeświadczeni, że niestety wolność do nas na razie nie przyszła.
The parties of the left that had formed part of the government in exile realigned their allegiance as the authority of the London Poles disintegrated. In the month that followed, native Polish communists and Moscow manoeuvred for power. But in the eyes of many Poles, the argument was academic. The flower of the nation's youth had been destroyed, and any who might have carried the banner of liberal democracy had been ruthlessly eliminated. For all their courage and sacrifice, they had simply exchanged one occupying power for another. All the paraphernalia of a Stalinist dictatorship, secret police, informers, show trials, torture, intimidation, and the Gulag were in place. Debate and dissent were crushed. Elections were rigged. History was rewritten to criminalize the Home Army. it was not quite the end of the story. Small units of patriots continued to resist the new regime for a further 2 years before they were suppressed. But the spirit of the Poles had never been extinguished. It survived to emerge again in the Gdansk shipyards in 1980, heralding a return to democracy a few years later.